It was April 14th, 1865, a night that would go down in history. The Civil War had just ended 5 days prior, when the Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered his troops to the Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. Finally, 4 years of violent conflicts had come to their end. This was the time to celebrate. Throughout the North, bars were full, fireworks were shot off, parades were held, and everyone was in a celebratory mood. That was including the President, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln invited the Union General, Ulysses S. Grant, and his wife to join him at a celebration at the Ford Theater, but they declined, and instead went to visit some relatives in New Jersey. Lincoln also extended this invite to a few others, including his son, Robert Lincoln, and the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, but they too declined this offer. This does not go to say that he went alone, though. He and his wife were accompanied by Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris, who graciously accepted his invite. That night, at the Ford Theater, Lincoln, Rathbone, and their wives, or soon-to-be, were seated in a makeshift presidential box to watch the comedy play, Our American Cousin. With this comedic performance, the atmosphere at the theater was joyful and followed by a lot of laughter. The audience laughed along with the performance, and so did Lincoln. Little did he know that right behind him was the man who would end his life, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. John Wilkes Booth, the man who would assassinate Lincoln. He may be known for this assassination, but at the time, he was known to be a popular actor who frequently performed at Ford's Theater. This is why it didn't raise much suspicion when he was at the theater on the fateful night. But Booth knew the theater's layout very well. He knew the ways to get in, he knew the ways to get out, which is perhaps how he was so easily able to sneak into the building and past the presidential guards and into the viewing box. Booth waited for one specific line right behind Lincoln, in the viewing box. He waited for the line, "Don't you know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess it's enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you stock-delising old man-trap," to be spoken. And back then, this was quite a humorous line. When it was said, the crowd would erupt in laughter, which was a perfect time for Booth to strike. The theater would be loud. His gunshot would barely be heard. So he fired. He fired his .44 caliber pistol straight at the back of Lincoln's head, leading to a fatal wound. The president would be dead the next morning. This bullet would end his life. After shooting the 16th president, John Wilkes Booth needed to flee the scene. He leapt from the presidential booth and onto the stage, breaking his left leg in the process. On that stage, he proceeded to shout a phrase at the crowd. Some witnesses claim that he shouted in Greek, "Sic semper tyrannis," meaning thus always to tyrants, while others claim he also declared that the South was avenged. No matter which phrase was actually shouted, it was clear that it was some sort of act of revenge in which he wanted to play a hero. He wanted to be known as the man who took down a tyrannical leader. Although things clearly didn't go as planned. He isn't known for taking down a tyrant, is he? No. He is known for assassinating one of the best presidents the U.S. has had thus far. After making this proclamation on the stage, he finally fled the scene through a side stage door which led to an alleyway, and he hopped on a horse he rented. Thus the manhunt began. As he rode away, they were after him. This is the story of the assassination of the United States' 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, and the master plan of coordinated attacks behind it. Did Booth get away? Who were his co-conspirators? And what other government officials were on his hit list? All valid questions I will get into while I thoroughly explain this assassination case. To thoroughly understand why this happened, how it happened, and the master plan behind this, I'm going to start at the beginning. Way back to a time when killing the president was out of the picture, when John Wilkes Booth and his conspirators wanted to kidnap the president instead. First, I'm going to give you a bit of background into Booth and his motives. John Wilkes Booth was born on May 10th, 1838, making him only 26 when he assassinated Lincoln. Growing up, he had a very comfortable childhood. He grew up on a farm in Maryland, and although Maryland was a slave state, his family didn't really keep slaves. I say really because they didn't technically own them, but they still relied on forced labor. Junius Booth, John Wilkes Booth's father, opposed slavery morally, but he still partook in its practice by renting servants and field hands from neighboring enslavers. This led John Wilkes Booth, growing up in a situation where he felt that black Americans were inferior to whites and that slavery was generally a good practice. So, when it came to the Civil War, he supported the South, even though he technically lived in the North. Booth was a strong supporter of slavery and the Confederacy, which explains his disdain for Lincoln, who wanted to abolish slavery's practices. Back to his plan. Planning began once he met his co-conspirators. His first mate was this man, Samuel Mudd, but I'll refer to him as Dr. Mudd. Both Booth and Mudd met on December 23rd, 1964, when Dr. Mudd was doing some Christmas shopping in Washington. Dr. Mudd was a tobacco farmer in Maryland and a doctor, which will be important later. Remember, he is a doctor. It is through this Dr. Mudd that Booth was able to meet a co-conspirator by the name of John Surratt. It was at Surratt's boarding house that all of the plans are made for the assassination as well as kidnapping. The next co-conspirator was David Harold, the guide of their group. Next, they needed to find the muscle of their group, which would be Lewis Powell, who Booth met through Surratt, Samuel Arnold, a schoolmate of Booth's, and Michael O'Loughlin, Jr., a childhood friend that literally grew up across the street from Booth. These 6 men had originally planned to abduct Lincoln at Campbell's General Hospital. They would then capture him as he was leaving in his carriage, and hold him hostage until the government released some Confederate soldiers that they were holding captive. But this plan ultimately failed when Lincoln canceled his plans for that day. Once this plan failed, they devised another kidnapping attempt that would take place at Ford's Theater, the very place where Lincoln was ultimately assassinated. This seemed like a good idea to Booth, because he was so familiar with the location, but the other co-conspirators, they disagreed. They thought it'd be impossible to kidnap the president in front of an entire audience, a full house of people, and if, even by that very slim chance, they made it out with the president, they'd run into a sentinel. To which Booth remarked that they would just have to shoot the sentinel. Quickly, Booth, Michael O'Loughlin, Jr., and Samuel Arnold figured that Booth was intending for a shootout, which neither wanted to occur, because they could die. It would be crazy to do such a thing. So Arnold told Booth that he could be the leader of the party, but not my executioner, which resulted in an argument between the two, and Arnold eventually stating, "Gentlemen, if this is not accomplished this week, I forever withdraw from it," meaning if they did not go through their plan by the week's end, he would not be part of it any longer, and he kept to his word, cutting ties with the kidnapping plan in its entirety just later that week, and with him O'Loughlin, Jr. left as well. On the very same night that these men argued over the new kidnapping plan, Ulysses S. Grant, the Union general, was in the process of releasing 1,000 Confederate prisoners, which meant there was no need to abduct Lincoln in order to get the prisoners freed. They were already freed. So there's a happy ending, right? The prisoners are released, Lincoln hadn't been kidnapped. It's a win-win for both sides. Wrong. This was the turning point in Booth's plans. He went from kidnapping to assassination. Although, even his assassination plan wasn't as simple as it seemed. In fact, it was part of a larger scheme to kill Lincoln, his Vice President Andrew Johnson, and the Secretary of State William H. Seward, and they would do it in one night. Each of his remaining co-conspirators were tasked with a target to assassinate, or a specific role in this plot. Arguably, the man tasked with the least important role was either John Surratt or David Harold. Surratt wasn't tasked with a role in the plot, but rather just helping to plan the assassination and providing the safe house, while David Harold simply aided in Booth's escape and served as a guide to the Secretary of State Seward's house. Which brings me to the next person, Lewis Powell, the man tasked with killing the Secretary of State, William H. Seward. Lastly, there's George Atzerodt, who was tasked with killing the VP, Andrew Johnson. Now that we've established who was tasked with killing who, the question is, were they successful? First, we have George Atzerodt, the man tasked with killing the Vice President. He began his preparations by booking himself a room in the Kirkwood, where the VP, Andrew Johnson, was staying. Although, on the fateful night of April 14th, the night they planned to go through with the murder, Atzerodt lost his nerve and didn't go through with it. Instead, he spent the night drinking at a hotel bar and wandering drunkenly through the streets of Washington. Despite him not going through with the plan, he was arrested on April 20th on the basis of being involved in the conspiracy to assassinate President Lincoln and Vice President Andrew Johnson. Next, there was Lewis Powell, the man tasked with killing the Secretary of State, William H. Seward. What was intended to be a one-and-done assassination of only Seward went horribly wrong, leaving many more people injured than he intended. Despite this horrible outcome, it was going well at the beginning. Just as planned, David Harold led Powell to the Secretary of State, Seward's home. He disguised his motives well and claimed he was sent by Seward's physician, Dr. Verdi, to deliver medicine. The first servant he encountered in the home, William H. Bell, was a bit suspicious, but he let Powell through. Because Seward had just been injured, he broke a jaw and right arm in a carriage incident, so it seemed very plausible that his physician would send someone to deliver medicine that would further his healing process. As Powell was making his way into Seward's room, just throughout the house, he ran into Seward's 34-year-old son, Frederick. Frederick peered into Seward's room on the 3rd floor and told Powell that his father was asleep and shouldn't be disturbed. This was Frederick kind of cueing Powell to take his leave, but Powell had a mission to carry out. He had to get into Seward's room to assassinate him. So, there was no way he'd leave now. But it looked like he was leaving. Powell gave the medicine to Frederick, and Frederick said he'd passed it on to his father. And then Powell turned around, took a few steps down the stairs, so he seemed to be listening, leaving the residence, right? Until he spun around and whipped out an 1858 Whitney Navy revolver, pointed it straight at Frederick's head, and pulled the trigger, only for a click to be heard. It misfired. So, Powell resorted to hitting Frederick with the revolver. Powell pummeled Frederick numerous times in the head, so much so that he literally broke the revolver. Inside Seward's bedroom, Fanny Seward, William H. Seward's daughter, and George Foster Robinson, Seward's nurse, as well as Fanny Robinson, his 20-year-old daughter, all heard the commotion. Upon hearing the ruckus outside, George Robinson opened the door to the hallway, and I don't know what gave him such bravery to do this. Maybe it was his experience in war as a sergeant in the 8th Maine Regiment, or maybe it was just adrenaline in the moment. But either way, he was injured. While serving in the army, Robinson had sustained a leg injury, and this injury would make it much harder for him to fight off the intruder. Oh, and to make things worse, he didn't have a weapon. Powell did. I guess this wasn't going to be a fair fight. Anyway, back to Robinson. Just as Robinson opened the door to figure out the situation outside of Seward's bedroom, Powell shoved his way into the room and slashed Robinson in the head with a Bowie knife. This knocked him to the floor, but he wasn't down for good. Powell scurried over to Seward's bedside, stabbed him in the neck and face. Right then, Robinson sprung back up into action, dragging Powell off of Seward. In doing this, Seward fell out of Powell's reach and onto the other side of the bed. Now this fight was between Robinson and Powell. But, again, Powell was armed, and he used this to his advantage. He stabbed Robinson in the shoulder numerous times while he was being dragged away, and once Robinson finally released Powell from his grip, he fled the scene. On his way down 3 flights of stairs, Powell stabbed Seward's elder son, Augustus H. Seward, in the hand. Further down the flight of stairs was Emmerich W. Hansel, a War Department messenger who was staying in the Seward family home. Caught in this crossfire, Hansel got stabbed in the back. Literally. He had a 3-inch deep cut in his back that just barely missed his lungs. After he stabbed almost the entire household, Powell finally escaped and rode his horse straight back to Mary Surratt's boarding house, where all the plans for the assassinations and kidnappings occurred. This is where he would hide out until 5 days later he was arrested on suspicion of his involvement in the attempted assassination. Surprisingly, none of the wounds Powell inflicted were fatal, and his target, the Secretary of State, William H. Seward, went on to live 7 more years after the attack. As for Robinson, he was later awarded $5,000 and a gold medal for his bravery in defending the Secretary of State. Lastly, there is John Wilkes Booth and his assassination of the United States' 16th President, Abraham Lincoln. It began on April 14th, just 5 days after the Civil War ended. Abraham Lincoln was at Ford's Theater celebrating victory, much like the rest of the nation. He and his wife were accompanied by Major Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, Clara Harris. Together, they watched the comedy performance, Our American Cousin. At about 10 o'clock that very night, John Wilkes Booth walked in the front door of the theater, and he came up the stairs, crossed the back of the balcony, and made his way to the presidential box. When Booth walked up to the presidential box, there were no guards in sight. In fact, Lincoln's guard, John Parker, was at the saloon next door, meaning nobody was there to stop him. So he entered the presidential box with ease, no questions asked. He waited there for the funniest moment in the play, where the line, "Don't you know the manners of good society, eh? Well, I guess I know enough to turn you inside out, old gal, you stock-delizing old man-trap," was spoken. And as the crowd roared with laughter, John Wilkes Booth stepped in, pointed his .44 caliber pistol at Lincoln's head, and fired. Bullet straight to the back of the head. President Lincoln slumped forward in his chair, unconscious and losing blood fast. Immediately after the shots were fired, Major Henry Rathbone jumped in and tried to stop Booth from escaping. John Wilkes Booth, though, had another weapon, a knife. So he slashed him with that knife and cut his arm. Then he tried to jump from the presidential box and onto the stage. But Major Henry Rathbone was still trying to stop him. So he landed quite hard on the stage, breaking his leg. Instead of escaping, he stood up on the stage and yelled to the audience, "Sic semper tyrannis!" meaning thus always to tyrants, which is a form of rebellion against tyrannical leaders. Others in the audience argue, though, that he shouted, "The South is avenged!" Either way, it seemed to him that this was some sort of heroic act of vengeance. Well, no matter what was shouted, he had just assassinated the president. He had to escape. And so he did. He ran out the back door, through an alleyway, and jumped onto his rented horse, and rode away with his co-conspirator, David Harold, in tow. Both Harold and Booth rode their horses to the southern Maryland and grabbed guns from a tavern owned by a woman named Mary Surratt. Remember that name, Surratt, the boarding house. Anywho, later, at about 4 a.m., on April 15th, the next morning, Booth and Harold arrive at Dr. Samuel Mudd's house. Dr. Mudd treated Booth's broken leg then. It was on that very same day, at 7:22 a.m., that Lincoln would pass away from the bullet wound, just across the road from Ford's Theater. Booth and Harold were on the run for 11 more days, until they were apprehended in a tobacco barn near Bowling Green, Virginia. When the cavalry came to apprehend them, Harold gave himself up, but Booth was not so willing to do that. He would not cooperate, and in order to arrest Booth, they needed him to leave the barn which he was hiding out in. So they attempted to smoke him out. They lit the barn roof on fire, which led Booth to drop his crutch and make his way toward the exit, whereupon he was shot and killed by Corporal Boston Corbett, who feared that Booth would shoot him first. Now it is known that Booth died, but what was to come of his other co-conspirators? During the legal investigation into Lincoln's assassination, more than 100 people were arrested under suspicion of aiding Booth, but most of that 100 were released due to lack of evidence in their involvement. As for the people who were actually involved, the co-conspirators, well, they weren't as lucky. Remember John Surratt, who aided in developing the kidnapping and assassination plan? Well, he fled the country, and he first went to Canada, then England, and didn't stand trial until 1867, 3 years later, when he was actually apprehended in Europe. At the trial, he was charged with murder in connection to the assassination of President Lincoln, but since he denied any participation in the assassination itself, and instead only admitted to involvement in the kidnapping plot, it just ended in a mistrial. For some reason, he seemed to take the news of a mistrial as the public, supporting his actions or something along those lines, because right after being set free, he decided to establish a lecture tour that would explain his role in the kidnapping plot in 1870. This lecture tour was canceled. I don't know why he thought that was a good idea. But anyway, eventually John Surratt died in 1916, and he was the last surviving Lincoln conspirator. The next people charged was Dr. Mudd, Samuel Arnold, Michael O'Loughlin Jr., and all three of them received life sentences of hard labor for conspiracy to murder President Abraham Lincoln. Samuel Arnold and Dr. Mudd would go on to be pardoned in 1869 by President Andrew Jackson. Yes, the same Andrew Jackson that was Lincoln's vice president, the one that Atzerodt was going to murder. I don't know why he would have pardoned them, but he did. Anywho, Dr. Mudd later died of pneumonia in 1883, while Arnold went on to live until 1906. Towards the end of his life, in 1902, Arnold published a memoir that he hoped would clear his name. As for Michael O'Loughlin Jr., he didn't even live long enough to be pardoned like his co-conspirators. He died in prison in 1867, just 2 years after being convicted. Next, there's George Atzerodt, and although he didn't go through with the plan to assassinate the Vice President Andrew Johnson, he was still convicted and hung on July 7th, 1865, for conspiracy to commit murder. On that very same day, David Harold and Lewis Powell were hung as well. Those three men were not the only people hanged that day. Along with them, Mary Surratt, who operated the Surratt boarding house, where the plans were made and where Powell hid after his attempted assassination on Seward. She was also hung, but to this day, it is still debated over if she's innocent or guilty, but nonetheless, she was still convicted of conspiring to assassinate Abraham Lincoln and hung for that, making her the first woman executed by the federal government in the United States. The last person convicted for conspiring with Booth is someone I haven't even mentioned yet, because it's very much so debated over if he intended on being involved or not. His name is Edmund Spangler, or Ned for short. In trial, it was ruled that Ned was guilty of helping Lincoln's assassin escape, so helping Booth leave. But that was because he held the horse outside for Booth, Booth's escape horse, because he was asked to do so. And since he was a stagehand at the theater and Booth was an actor there, it may have just been a favor for a friend rather than a purposeful involvement in the plot to assassinate Lincoln. According to that crime, though, he was sentenced to 6 years of hard labor in prison and later was pardoned along with Mudd and Surratt. And that is the story of Lincoln's assassination, the master plan behind it, and the kidnapping plans that came before it, as well as the aftermath.